The Deadliest. Radioactive Places on Earth. Part 3.
Number 10. The Los Alamos National Laboratory Legacy Sites in New Mexico. Los Alamos, New Mexico, right? It's famous as the birthplace of the atomic bomb. During World War II, the top-secret Manhattan Project brought scientists together here to design and build the first nuclear weapons. The lab still remains active today as a hub of research, but scattered around the area are abandoned legacy sites that are contaminated with radioactive material. When Los Alamos was established in 1943, the urgency of wartime development meant that safety and waste disposal often came second to speed. Plutonium, uranium, and other radioactive materials were handled in facilities here that lacked modern containment. Waste from experiments and weapon production was frequently buried in shallow pits or dumped into nearby canyons. One of the most contaminated areas is known as the Technical Area 21, or the DP site, where plutonium processing happened during the Manhattan Project and the Cold War. The site's now abandoned, with large sections fenced off to prevent access, and another abandoned area known as Acid Canyon received untreated liquid waste directly from the lab, which contaminated the soils and sediments. Though much of it has since been remediated, traces do remain. The Cold War expanded Los Alamos' nuclear work, producing even more waste, and as research moved into new buildings, older facilities were left unused. And today many of these structures no longer exist, but their footprints remain sealed under restricted zones. On one hand, it's a thriving modern laboratory. On the other, it's surrounded by reminders of uncontrolled practices of the past. Even decades later, the cost and complexity of the cleanup means that radioactive contamination will persist. Number 9. The Polygon of Totskoy, Orenburg, Russia. The Totskoy nuclear test site, located in Russia's Orenburg region, it's one of the lesser-known but still significant radioactive landscapes. Unlike the Semipalatinsk test site or the better-documented Mayak complex, Totskoy is standing out for the way it combined nuclear weapons testing with live military exercises. The site and the villages around it remain linked to contamination and partially abandoned today. In September of 1954, the Soviet Union carried out a nuclear weapons test here as part of a military exercise. A nuclear bomb with a yield of around 40 kilotons, that's more than twice the size of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima, was detonated above the ground. What made this test unusual and hazardous was that tens of thousands of soldiers were ordered to participate in the exercise immediately after the explosion. Troops were moved through the contaminated zone, practicing maneuvers as if fighting in a real nuclear war. Local civilians, too, weren't evacuated before the test, and fallout spread across nearby villages. For decades, the full details of the test were kept secret, and the soldiers involved were sworn to silence. Many later suffered long-term health effects, but only in the late 80s did information about the exercise become widely known. Villages near the blast site experienced population decline, with some families leaving due to health concerns or lack of agricultural viability, and today Totskoy is remembered more for its human impact than its physical ruins. The blast crater, the contaminated soil, and the traces of fallout in nearby systems highlights the dangers of using these populated regions for testing. It reflects the mindset of the Cold War era, when governments were willing to use their own citizens in exercises to better understand the effects of nuclear weapons, and the secrecy surrounding the event meant that people lived for decades with little acknowledgement of the risks they faced. Though Totskoy lacks the notoriety of Semipalatinsk or Chernobyl, it remains an important case study in radioactive abandonment. In the South Pacific, way away from continental population centers, are two atolls that became the focus of French nuclear testing during the Cold War: Mururoa and Fangataufa. Between 1966 and 1996, France conducted 193 nuclear tests at these locations. First in the atmosphere and later underground. Today, though, both atolls contained abandoned facilities and contaminated land. When France started its nuclear program in the 1960s, it sought these remote sites outside of metropolitan France to minimize international scrutiny and the domestic opposition, of course. French Polynesia was selected, and those two sites were transformed into military zones. Airstrips, docks, bunkers, and observation towers were constructed to support the tests. Local islanders were relocated or restricted from entering certain areas, though the fallout spread well beyond the immediate test zones. Fallout reached inhabited parts of French Polynesia, which exposed local populations to radiation. Soldiers, technicians, and laborers also working on the atolls were exposed, often with inadequate protective measures. Reports of cancers and other radiation-linked illnesses among the veterans and local peoples have emerged in the decades since. After 1974, tests shifted underground, with nuclear devices detonated beneath the coral atoll. While this did reduce atmospheric fallout, it created new problems. Underground blasts fractured the geological structure of the atolls, which raised concerns about leakage into the ocean. By 1996, international pressure and domestic protest forced France to halt the nuclear testing. Some equipment was dismantled, but the atoll remains marked by craters, collapsed sections, and restricted zones. Today it's uninhabited except for some limited French military presence involved in the monitoring. Former test infrastructure lies unused, slowly decaying. Local communities, though, continue to demand recognition and compensation for the health effects, while the environmental groups call for greater international oversight. Unlike other abandoned radioactive sites, which are often industrial or military landscapes, these two were islands with ecosystems and traditional uses that have been permanently altered. The abandonment is both physical, in the form of deserted military structures, and cultural, as the islanders lost their access to ancestral lands. Radioactive fallout reached communities across the Pacific, and underground detonations left the invisible risks beneath the atolls. Decades after the last test, the land remains unsafe, and the facilities remain abandoned, and the scars of nuclear development are still felt by people who never chose to be part of it. Number 7. Wittenoom, Western Australia. In the southern hemisphere, Wittenoom in Western Australia represents another kind of radioactive abandonment, not from nuclear weapons or reactors, but from mining asbestos contaminated with radioactive material. Though asbestos was the primary hazard, blue asbestos mined here in the mid-20th century also carried natural radioactive elements, including thorium and uranium, which compounded the risks. Wittenoom was established in the 1930s to support crocodolite or blue asbestos mining, which grew rapidly in the 1940s and 50s. At its peak, the town had several thousand residents, complete with schools, shops, and community facilities. The asbestos ore contained not only dangerous fibers, but also trace amounts of radioactive isotopes. Mining and milling here released both the asbestos dust and radioactive particles into the environment, which contaminated soil, tailing piles, and surrounding valleys. By the 1960s, health problems linked to asbestos exposure became undeniable. Workers and residents developed high rates of mesothelioma and other lung diseases. Although asbestos was the most visible killer, radioactive exposure from the ore contributed additional long-term risks. The mine did close in 1966, and over the following decades, the town declined as residents left. The Australian government officially de-gazetted Wittenoom as a town in 2007, removing it from official maps and cutting off basic services. Today, it's considered the most contaminated site in Australia. Entire neighborhoods are abandoned, with houses overtaken by sand and weeds. Visitors, of course, are discouraged, and the site remains uninhabited except for a handful of holdouts who refuse to leave. While it lacks the dramatic image of a nuclear crater or a ruined reactor, the ghostly streets and silent houses here are every bit as striking. Wittenoom shows how a radioactive abandonment is not limited to weapons or power plants. It can also come from careless extraction of naturally radioactive minerals that, once disturbed, leave behind a toxic legacy. Number 6. Palomares, Andalusia, Spain. The village of Palomares in Andalusia, in Spain, it's not abandoned in the way ghost towns or sealed exclusion zones are, but part of its landscape remained effectively deserted due to radioactive contamination from an accident that happened in 1966. This incident, involving a U.S. military aircraft, scattered plutonium across the countryside, leaving behind contaminated soil and abandoned plots of land. On January 17, 1966, a U.S. Air Force B-52 bomber carrying 4 hydrogen bombs collided with a refueling tanker mid-air over the Mediterranean coast of Spain. The collision caused the bomber to break apart, and the bombs fell near the fishing village of Palomares. 2 of the bombs' non-nuclear explosives detonated on impact with the ground, dispersing plutonium over a wide area. The radioactive dust settled on the farmland, the homes, and the fields around the village. American and Spanish authorities quickly launched a cleanup operation. Contaminated soil was scraped up and shipped to the United States for disposal, while some areas were plowed under in an attempt to dilute the contamination. However, those efforts were incomplete. Large amounts of radioactive soil were removed, and significant amounts of plutonium, though, remained in the environment, particularly in areas where dust had blown or seeped into deeper soil layers. While the village itself continued to be inhabited, specific plots of land were declared off-limits. Residents lived alongside these restricted zones, aware that sections of their farmland remained too contaminated for safe use. Political and cultural imprint. At the time, Spanish authorities downplayed the contamination, while U.S. officials emphasized that the hydrogen bomb warheads had not detonated. Nevertheless, the image of American military personnel in protective suits scraping soil from Spanish fields left a strong impression on the public. The cleanup became a symbol of Cold War risks reaching into everyday civilian life. Decades later, studies continued to detect residual plutonium in the soil. In 2015, the Spanish and U.S. governments reached an agreement to remove additional contaminated soil and ship it to a U.S. disposal site. But progress has been slow. The restricted areas remain fenced off and unused. The story of this one shows how accidents involving nuclear weapons can leave lasting environmental scars, even without a nuclear detonation. Plutonium does have a half-life of over 24,000 years, meaning the contaminated soils will remain hazardous for millennia, and while the scale is smaller than some other nuclear sites. This one shows how radioactive contamination can carve out uninhabitable pockets within an otherwise thriving community, creating these ghost landscapes where people still live just beyond the fence lines.